Hi, and welcome back to Rediscovering RC. My personal journey as I venture back into the world of RC and RC racing after an almost 20-year hiatus. I'm your host Julio, and if you've been following along with my series, yes, my TLR 22X-4 four-wheel drive buggy is finally complete. Now first off, before I start with my notes that I took during the build, I just want to get a couple of things off my chest. First of all, for whatever reason, building this buggy was an absolute dream. And funny enough, even though the 22 5.0 DC Elite is a technically simpler buggy, given that it's two-wheel drive, this one just seemed easier to put together. So the other thing I want to point out is, as you can see, the body is already painted. I wish I could take credit for such a fabulous paint job, but to be honest, I commissioned the work of Easy Custom Airbrush Graphics. They did a fantastic job. He was great to deal with, and again, if you're in need of a painter, go ahead and look him up on Facebook. So with all that said, let's get to the notes. All right, let's get started with bag A, which is the differentials. So this is one of the things that when I read online, a lot of people seem to be having a couple of problems here and there with regards to them. So first off, a lot of people were complaining about having difficulty sticking the insert into the differential gear. Now that in itself, after opening the kit and getting to work on it, was kind of confusing to me, because the insert, which it goes along the center where the outdrive eventually gets installed, was actually on the gear to begin with. So with that being said, I just made sure, and one of the things that I would recommend to you as well if you're building this kit, is just go ahead and pre-fit the outdrives on all four entry points on the differential to make sure that maybe one might be a little bit tighter due to tolerances. So I would totally recommend that you pre-fit everything before you start assembling. The other thing also is, okay, when it comes time to fill the diffs, just take your time. You want to try to be as precise as possible. The manual does call for, filling it to a specific weight. Make sure you got yourself a good, decent scale, that's precise enough for that. And depending on whether you build the differential either with the metal gears that come in the kit or composite gears, which right now are kind of hard to get, but I know a lot of people might have gotten them before they ran out. Again, try to be as precise as possible. When you get close to the end, just one little drop at a time to make sure you get at least within a hundredth there of what they were requesting. Other than that, most importantly, okay, the diffs have two different weights. You got a 5,000 weight and a 7,000 weight. So make sure you have a Sharpie. You might have seen in my video, I had a Sharpie and I marked them specifically. Make sure you mark them, because later on when it comes time to put them in the car, you'll want to know which one is which. Personally, what I did is that I put a dot to simplify, to signify 5K, and another two lines on the 7K one to signify, 5 plus 2 equals 7. So whatever you want to use, just make sure you mark them, because it's going to be a while before you get to installing them in the car. And that completes my notes for bag A. Let's get on to bag B. Alrighty, so bag B is really the slipper, the center slipper. So not really much to say about this, but if you saw my, the notes or my thinking out loud when I was building the kit, it was a little confusing at first when I was reading the manual. However, one of the precautions that are in step B2, you want to make sure you thread that collar down just enough so that you can get clearance for the outdrive that's going to go on to the end, the long end of that center slipper. So basically, it was a little tough. I tried the back thread to make sure that I wasn't cross-threading or anything like that, but it was still tough. I had to get some pliers to kind of like crank it down a little bit once I had the spring assembly and everything put in there. And really, you just want to make sure that the diff comes down and there's no clearance there, because the final step is going to be to turn that down a little bit to get just that one full turn of difference between the outdrive and that little collar that's there that holds down your spring. So really not much to say there. The only other thing that I could say is that you will have to put thread lock on both the screw that holds down the outdrive on that long end, not to mention the set screw that holds the collar in place. So those are pretty much my notes for bag B. Let's get on to bag C. Alright, so here's where the face palms begin. And to be clear up front, the manual is fantastic. Other than a few minor discrepancies that I pointed out in the build video, everything is there. So really, it was my fault. I'm going to be upfront and say that. So let's get into it. First off, tools. The TLR tools that they offer are fantastic. Both the ball cup wrench and the turnbuckle wrench will save you a lot of time as far as building it. So I totally recommend those. The part numbers for those are in my build video, so be on the lookout for those if you want to get yourself a set. Now, measuring carefully. Now, one of the things that I wish I would have done different after the fact is that I was trying to measure the inside of the turnbuckles. And the big problem with that is, and TLR does give you the measurements for both the full length and what the distance in between the ball cups on the inside. But what happens is that you end up getting sometimes the caliper will get stuck on a thread while you're trying to measure. So you might take a measurement, adjust, and then you go to measure again and you're like way off, and it doesn't make sense. After the fact, it made sense to me that I was probably getting hung up on the threads, and it cost me a little bit of time. If you take a look at the video, you'll notice that it was tedious just going back and forth, measuring. So other than that, again, I just recommend you measure carefully. The numbers are there so that you get the proper cambers, and again, I would stick to measuring the outside. Now where I screwed up is that if you noticed in the video, I was making basically the ball cups facing the same way. And the manual clearly shows you that you should have them basically at a 90-degree offset. And the reason is because one ball cup is going to be on the shock tower, which is going to be vertical, and then the other one is going to be on the ball stud that's on the carrier, which is horizontal. So that's something that I ignored. I made all of mine flat, and I paid for it later on when it came time to assemble. So that's all I have for bag C. Let's get on to bag D. Okay, so on to bag D, and bag D is the shocks. So first off, one of the things that you should do is basically, and it says it in the instructions, is be sure to clean the residue that on the shock shafts, because they have like oils in manufacturing and all that. So you want to take some motor spray. In my case, I used like electrical contact cleaner just to clean off the shock shafts. Likewise, you want to do that also to the screws that you use to screw the pistons onto the end of the shaft. So go ahead and clean those. The other thing I would advise is that the X-rings that go into the building of the shock cartridge, you want to go ahead and like soak those in shock oil first. Just set aside a little piece of plastic, put some shock oil on it, and then go ahead and let them soak while you're prepping your area to start building the shocks. Now in my case, I decided to try 110% Racing's RC Sweat. I had heard some good things about it, so I went ahead and soaked those with the RC Sweat instead. But in either case, it might be a good practice to just prep your X-rings before you start assembling the shock. So the other thing that I personally do, it's not in the manual, but when it comes time to get the shaft through the shock body, I like to put a couple of drops both at the base of the shaft to let that oil seep into the cartridge area. And I also put a drop or two on the threads of the shock shaft as I'm sliding in. It's all about lubricating the tip of the piston, or the shaft rather, as it goes down through the cartridge area and all those silicone rings. So you definitely don't want to damage those, and the oil will help you prevent that. The other thing also is be very careful, because there are a pair of shock limiters, extension limiters that go into the fronts. So you want to make sure you put those. And there's also little limiters when you put the eyelets on. There's going to be a little limiter that goes on the end inside the ball cup. Now what I personally did is I slit that up near the actual shock itself, put in the shock cup at the end, and then let that slide down. I tried to do it the first time with that little spacer, and it gave me all kinds of problems when I had it down at the bottoms. So go ahead and move those up, put in the cups when you get the springs on them, and then let them settle back down. And that's pretty much all I have for bag D. So let's move on to bag E. Alrighty, so in bag E is when you're going to start building up the chassis itself. So this is where I found a couple of the discrepancies that I mentioned in my build. The first one being is that when you start putting the side rails onto the main chassis, it calls for 4 screws, okay, the shorter ones, and then there's 2 longer ones, screw 5962. Now at the top where you get the little diagram of all the screws so you can get the proper lengths and all, it tells you that you only need one 5962 screw. But in reality you need 2 of them, because those are the 2 longer screws that are basically going to hold the anchors for the battery band. So just keep that in mind. The screws are in the bag that's in, in that part of the assembly. So just make sure to set aside 2 instead of the 1. So the other small minor discrepancy, and I saw this in a couple of bags, and you'll see this, and I mentioned it in the build video, is that some of the bags don't correspond exactly to the step that you see in the manual. So for example, it started with bag E, where I got to step E3 and I hadn't even opened bag E3 yet. So you're going to find this in several bags moving forward, but don't worry, everything is still assembled. Finally, you'll be fine. You'll be just opening bags as you get to those steps. In the case of some bags, those steps are like one mini bag behind. So just be mindful of that. Okay, so the front brace for the steering. If you saw in the build video, I went ahead and purchased the optional front bulkhead and steering brace. And really, I decided to go ahead and install the one that keeps basically the steering posts together until I got to the step where I installed the front, the front gearbox. So if you want to leave it off, you can, but do keep in mind that there's two little, washers that get installed there. And for the sake of not losing the washers, I went ahead and installed that brace until I got to the gearbox on, and then installed the optional brace there. So the other thing to make note of, and this is really a comment that I kind of skipped in my build video when I was editing, but all the all the carbon fiber pieces, they're chamfered on one side. So again, the manual is very clear about that. Just to make sure you have them proper in terms of what side is chamfered and how it's supposed to go when you're aligning all your carbon fiber pieces. And finally, when you're installing the front diff brace, just to make sure that the bearing alignment is correct. It might be a little out of whack. In my case, one of the bearings on one side was for both of the diffs were a little difficult to put on. So just make sure you get that in. In the case of the front gearbox, what I was able to do is it was a little bit wider, but once I popped in the cover for the diff, for the gearbox, it all settled into place. So again, just be mindful of the alignment and you'll be all good there. So that's pretty much all my notes for bag E. So let's go on to bag F. Okay, so bag F is now where you're going to start working on the front gearbox and really the front part of the drivetrain here. So if all the talk about the out drives going into the diffs was like one of the big controversies with this kit, this was probably the other one, and it's the 5mm nut that's going to hold your pinion gear that goes into the gearbox. Now, a lot of 5mm drivers do not fit. The wall is too thick to fit inside of the pinion gear where you need to settle in that 5mm nut. But the kit does come with one of those little cross wrenches that has a 5mm nut that driver that fits in there. Now, some people were saying, "Oh, I can't use it; it doesn't fit." It does fit, but please take reference to my video. I pointed it out very clearly. Really, all you have to do is get the driver in there, and you can put it in the gearbox and just lay it there, and use the actual, basically the axle to twist it, and just hold the nut in place, and it'll tighten down. It's a lock nut, so once you get it down all the way, that's all you need. Again, as I mentioned in a little ahead in bag E, the bearings were a little tight for me on one side of the differential. So don't try to overexert yourself on it, but just get it in there. And again, in my case, in the front, it was a little tighter than it was in the rear. I was still able to get it all settled once I put the cap in and sealed up the gearbox. So again, don't get frustrated. Just give it a try. Try to get it fit in there, and all you need is to make sure that you just got some smooth motion there once you get that rotating. So the other thing is that part of it, when you do the installation, you're going to be installing, you're putting in some grease there on the gear as you install it into the gearbox. Be careful because the gearbox is open on the bottom, so as you're fiddling with the gearbox, you might stick your finger in there and get your finger full of grease, and before you know it, you'll have a big mess on your hands. So just be mindful of that so you don't get your fingers dirty with grease and make a bigger mess as you're putting the kit together. Other than that, after step F3, once the gearbox is installed, you can go ahead and, as I said, remove the steering brace and go ahead and install the optional front brace if you want. That's what I did. And again, it was just so that I wouldn't lose those little washers that go on top of the steering posts. So that's all my notes for bag F. Let's move on to bag G. Okay, so now we move on to bag G. And bag G is where you're pretty much going to be finishing up the front suspension. And really there's not too much to say. The approach towards the front axle drives were a little bit different from the CVAs in the rear. What you're going to find in the rear is very similar to what's on the 22 5.0 DC Elite. But in the front, they took a slightly different approach where you're really, around the steering knuckle, you're putting a composite cap over the pin that holds the CVA together. And that was a pleasure to build. Not only that, but the fit was really precise and so easy to build. A totally different experience from the CVA that I had in the back of the DC Elite. So we'll get into that later. But again, a dream to build, and that's really all I have to say. I mean, the spacing was excellent. Everything was very fitting and no binding anywhere. That front axle is very, very loose. So with that said, let's go on to bag H. Alrighty, so bag H is pretty much a repetition of bag F, except this time now you're going to be working on the gearbox in the rear. And maybe it was just me, but I found that the build was, this section was so much faster, probably because of the experience of bag F. So again, because you've already done it once, the rear is going to be very simple, and there's really nothing that I have to add. I mean, the assembly is identical, so just beware of the same exact things when you go to build the rear. And that's all for bag H. Let's move on to bag I. Alrighty, so now we're on the bag eye, and again, it's just a lot of repetition because much of what you've done in the front, you're kind of doing in the rear. Except that, you know, as I mentioned earlier, you're building out the CVAs, which are identical to the DC Elite if you build that kit. And this is really where my one and only frustration came with the kit, is that there is one bag that has basically the output, you know, the hub and the 4 pins for the CVA and that, you know, what holds the hub in place. So that was really my frustration because that's really what got me with the DC Elite. And those pins have a difference of 0.2 millimeters. So if you don't get out your calipers and look at them and measure them to make sure you've got the right ones, you're going to have problems with binding in your CVA. And that really should be, you know, your alert if something's wrong. When you go to put that bearing over the axle, the CVA axle, if you find any kind of problem, pull back, you know, measure your pins again, and make sure that you got the right pins to build the CVA. That's really the one big note about this entire build that I would recommend, is that you be very careful with that step. Lucky for me, I measured correctly. I got it, you know, I got it right the first time, and it was a very smooth build of both CVAs. You're going to complete the rear end there, basically the hubs, and this was another facepalm moment for me that I'll get into in a minute as part of my wrap up. But other than that, I mean, like I said, very similar to the front, straightforward and just a breeze to do. And this is really the part of the build where it started accelerating because, again, you're kind of repeating things that you already did in the front, but now you're doing them in the back. So with that being said, let's go on to bag J. Okay, so now we are at the final bag, bag J. And bag J is really just a little bit of cleanup, and it's going to vary from person to person depending on the electronics you have and whatnot. But really, you're going to be installing the servo, you're going to be installing your ESC, your motor, everything, and all the little final touches to get the build done. You're going to be putting the wings on and the wheels. So what can I say about this build? I mean, as far as my final thoughts, you know, again, there were a couple of facepalm moments for me, but again, it was all my fault, and I'll get into that in a minute. Really, the only possible heartbreak that you might have in this kit, again, is in the rear and those pins. And I really wish that, you know, basically that TLR would just keep the pin for the CVA with the CVA parts and the pins for the hub together, so that way you can separate those parts and you don't have to get into that precise measuring to see which one's 0.2 millimeters short. So again, that's really the one and only recommendation that I would give for TLR, is to see if somehow they could separate those parts in packaging so that it doesn't become a headache for people down the line. Now about the turnbuckles, this is where it kind of came back and stung me again. If you notice my last part of my build video, you're going to notice that the rear wheels seem odd. And this is where I kind of screwed up in the building of the hubs. And again, the information was there in the manual. I might have been tired. I guess I didn't read it right. But I basically got the ball stud installed backwards. So basically, instead of having the point of that triangle that makes up that aluminum piece with the ball, with the ball joint, I had it towards the rear. And what that did was that it kind of put the balls studs on the outside instead of the inside of that triangle. So what you're going to want on the left side and the right is you're going to want it on, it's going to be in a triangle where you got the point in the front and then 2 in the rear. You want it on the inside. What's going to happen if you don't have it right is that you're going to basically get some rub here between the wheel and the turnbuckle in that case. So I had to do a little bit of disassembly once I realized that. And again, because of all the issues that I had with not setting up the turnbuckles at facing 90 degrees like they should have been, I kind of had to redo this a little bit and just fix the camber. So that was a bit of a headache for me, but again, the manual was very clear, and to be honest, this was a dream build. Even better than the 22 5.0 DC Elite, if you can believe that, and I thought that was a really good build. So again, if you decide to get the 22X-4, I think you're going to have a fantastic time building it, and good luck. Well, that'll wrap up today's episode. Before I go, I just want to give a great big thanks to everyone out there who has supported me by viewing, liking, favoriting, and subscribing. You know, when I started this channel a couple of months ago, I had no idea that at this short run in that I would have almost 1,500 views on all my videos, not to mention almost 50 subscribers. So again, thank you very much. And please do me a favor, keep those comments coming, keep the feedback coming. It'll do me a world of good to giving you the content that you want to see. So until next time, take care and goodbye.